was supposed to be a symbol of strength, not something that would quietly tip and vanish. That's what one Iranian naval officer reportedly whispered when IRIS Sahand began to list and slowly roll on its side in Bandar Abbas port in 2024. But before its quiet descent, IRIS Sahand represented something far more potent, an emblem of national pride, and a declaration that Iran, too, could build and field a modern warship capable of long-range missions. The story of Sahand begins not with the ship itself, but with its class. Sahand belongs to the Moj-class frigates, a line of domestically produced Iranian warships modeled after the older British-made Alvand-class vessels. Each ship in this series was named with heavy symbolic resonance. Sahand, in particular, refers to Mount Sahand, a dormant volcano in northwestern Iran, silent, immense, and ever-present. This name wasn't chosen lightly. It reflected what the Iranian Navy wanted to project: quiet endurance backed by latent power. The Moj-class program was part of Iran's broader effort to achieve naval self-sufficiency. Faced with years of international sanctions and arms embargoes, the country was left with few choices but to cultivate its own shipbuilding industry. By the mid-2000s, Iranian engineers and defense planners began working intensively on reverse engineering older vessels and incorporating modern elements to meet their defensive needs. Sahand would be their most ambitious output yet, a modern warship built from scratch in Iran, launched under great national fanfare. Construction began at the Shahid Darvishi shipyard near Bandar Abbas, the country's key southern naval facility. Every rivet, every weld, every radar panel was seen as a statement of sovereignty. Unlike earlier Moj-class vessels that carried relatively basic equipment, Sahand was designed with stealthier lines, more robust electronic warfare capabilities, and a more imposing weapon suite. When it was finally launched in December 2018, a heavy sense of occasion filled the air. State media broadcast the event with triumphant music and glowing commentary. Footage showed the ship sliding into the waters of the Persian Gulf under the watchful eyes of naval commanders and political leaders alike. It was described as Iran's most advanced naval vessel at the time, a ship that could travel far beyond regional waters, a ship that could challenge blockades or make a statement in distant oceans. The Iranian government claimed that Sahand was equipped with sophisticated anti-aircraft missiles, surface-to-surface weaponry, and radar-evading design features. But beyond its military capability, it served a deeper political purpose. It was a floating narrative, a story of defiance, of technical prowess under pressure, and of regional ambition. This ambition was most clearly demonstrated by what Sahand was meant to do. Unlike many regional navies that rarely deploy ships far from their shores, Iran had loftier goals. Sahand was to be the flagship in a narrative that said, "We are present, we can reach the Atlantic, we can visit Russia, we can matter on the global stage." Of course, that story would take many turns, and in the end capsize. But before we get there, we must understand the machine itself. The next section dives deeper into what made IRIS Sahand a formidable presence, at least on paper, and why its design was as symbolic as it was functional. IRIS Sahand was never meant to blend in. Even at a distance, its silhouette stood out from Iran's older ships. At 300 tons and with a length of roughly 95 meters, the vessel was lean but not small. It was shaped with sharper angles and cleaner lines than its predecessors, an intentional choice meant to reduce radar cross-section and give the illusion of stealth. And that illusion mattered. In naval warfare, perception is half the game. Sahand was built not just to fight, but to be seen. Its design was an evolution of the Alvand-class ships Iran had inherited from its pre-revolution days. But Sahand didn't just repeat those blueprints. It layered in new technologies wherever domestic resources allowed. At the heart of the ship's defensive system was the Command Close-In Weapon System, CIWS, Iran's answer to the American Phalanx or the Russian Kashtan. This rotary cannon, mounted like a robotic turret on the deck, was designed to detect and destroy incoming anti-ship missiles at close range. It gave Sahand a last-ditch shield against threats that slipped through its outer perimeter. Then there were the offensive weapons. Sahand was reportedly armed with Qatar anti-ship cruise missiles, a platform that Iran had developed to reach ranges up to 200 kilometers. These missiles, if accurate and effectively guided, could pose a serious threat to regional adversaries in the narrow confines of the Persian Gulf. There were also torpedo tubes, a standard naval gun up front, and the rumored capability to launch medium-range surface-to-air missiles from vertical launch cells, though the extent of that system's readiness remains unclear. Its electronic suite was equally ambitious. The ASR-3D phased array radar was designed to detect aerial and surface targets across multiple ranges and altitudes. Iranian state media proudly claimed that Sahand could simultaneously track dozens of incoming threats, although such figures are difficult to verify independently. Still, the installation of an indigenous radar system indicated a level of domestic sophistication that Iran was eager to showcase. Powering all of this were 4 domestically built engines, which together gave the ship a top speed of around 25 knots. Perhaps more importantly, Sahand was said to have an extended operational range of 5,000 nautical miles. That was a remarkable claim for an Iranian vessel, which typically operated close to home. If true, it meant Sahand could sail as far as the South Atlantic or even the eastern seaboard of the Americas, without needing foreign ports or mid-sea refueling. But while the hardware received most of the attention, the symbolism was just as critical. The ship's hull number, 74, was painted in large white digits on its bow, a nod to the memory of the original Sahand frigate sunk by U.S. forces during Operation Praying Mantis in 1988. This was the new Sahand, rising from that memory, its sleek frame bearing the weight of an older war's trauma. Inside, crew quarters were reportedly upgraded compared to previous Iranian vessels. More automation meant a slightly smaller required crew size, around 140 personnel. That didn't make Sahand luxurious by any means, but it did reflect an effort to modernize naval life in tandem with ship design. For the sailors aboard, Sahand wasn't just a post. It was a demonstration of Iran's evolving naval doctrine, from coastal defense to distant projection. Yet, with ambition came risk. Sahand's systems, while formidable in theory, had rarely been tested under real combat conditions. It remained unclear how the ship would perform against electronic jamming, coordinated attacks, or prolonged blue water operations. But Iran was willing to find out. The journey of Sahand wasn't merely about defense, it was a bet that even with limited resources, a country under sanctions could produce a ship that might one day sail halfway across the world, carrying with it the story of a nation that refused to be docked. And then, in 21, it happened. Sahand left the Persian Gulf behind and entered uncharted waters. Its destination would astonish many, and its mission would take it far from home. In 21, the IRIS Sahand embarked on a journey that would not only stretch its physical capabilities, but test Iran's strategic resolve. For the first time in modern history, an Iranian warship would attempt to sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Alongside a converted oil tanker turned floating base, the Makran, Sahand formed a naval flotilla that would stun observers around the world by reaching the doorstep of Europe and then Russia. This wasn't a training mission, nor a regional patrol. It was a calculated projection of power, a move designed to challenge perceptions and break geographic limitations. Western analysts tracked the vessels closely as they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, a route chosen to avoid the heavily surveilled Suez Canal. For a country under intense maritime sanctions, merely getting that far was a statement in itself. The voyage lasted several weeks, during which time the Sahand demonstrated both endurance and adaptability. There were rumors of logistical support from friendly ports along the west coast of Africa, but Tehran maintained that the ships had made the entire voyage independently. The sight of the Sahand navigating through open Atlantic waters, hundreds of kilometers from Iran's traditional zone of influence, sent a clear diplomatic signal. Iran could reach anywhere, and it was no longer a purely regional actor. What made the journey even more symbolic was its culmination. The ship's arrival at St. Petersburg, Russia in July 2021. This was no coincidence. The Iranian flotilla had been invited to participate in Russia's annual Navy Day parade, a high-profile event designed to showcase Moscow's alliances and naval strength. As Sahand floated past Russian ships and foreign observers, flags waving in the Baltic breeze, it represented far more than a piece of steel. It was the centerpiece of a growing military relationship between Tehran and Moscow, and a visual marker of defiance in the face of Western isolation. For Iranian state media, the moment was electric. Footage of Sahand moored among warships from Russia, China, and India was broadcast proudly. Commentators hailed the voyage as historic. The furthest an Iranian warship had traveled since the 1979 revolution. Behind the cameras, naval officers knew what the voyage had demanded: careful planning, fuel efficiency, diplomatic maneuvering, and the kind of coordination that only a few years earlier would have been impossible. To the Iranian public, Sahand's journey became a rare moment of national pride on the global stage. It was a floating ambassador, sleek, silent, and visible in places where Iranian flags had not waved for decades. The voyage was framed as proof that Iranian engineering and determination could overcome not just mechanical limits, but political ones. But the journey was not without its critics. Some international defense experts questioned the military value of the mission. After all, Sahand had not engaged in combat or escorted cargo or even conducted joint drills. Others wondered about the cost. Maintaining such a long voyage, even with a tanker support ship, placed a strain on limited naval resources. And still, others raised concerns about safety, pointing to unconfirmed reports of technical glitches and mechanical strain endured during the Atlantic crossing. Regardless of these critiques, what remained undeniable was the voyage's impact. For a ship launched just a few years earlier, Sahand had become more than a warship. It had transformed into a platform for diplomatic theater, a mobile stage where Iran could perform its message to the world, that it was still in the game, still capable, still reaching. That summer, as Sahand made its way back from Russia and returned to more familiar waters, it carried with it the memory of waves from 3 continents. It had seen the coasts of Africa, breathed the Atlantic winds, and saluted foreign admirals. For its crew, it was the journey of a lifetime. For its designers, it was vindication. And for its nation, it was a declaration of intent. But that triumphant narrative would not last forever. 3 years later, in a moment of eerie stillness, Sahand would lean slowly onto its side in the same port where it had once been launched with pride. What caused this turn? That is the story that follows. The morning of July 6, 2024, began like any other in Bandar Abbas. Dock workers moved between vessels, equipment clattered in the dry air, and the harbor shimmered under the weight of the summer heat. But by mid-morning, whispers began to ripple through the naval base. Something was wrong with the Sahand. At first, it appeared minor, just a slight list to starboard. Some assumed it was a ballast adjustment or minor maintenance imbalance. But within hours, the lean deepened. By afternoon, images began circulating online. IRIS Sahand, the pride of Iran's navy, was visibly tilting, its hull dipping alarmingly toward the sea. Then came the unthinkable. The ship capsized. Videos surfaced across social media showing the once proud frigate resting on its side, half submerged at its berth. The gun turret pointed helplessly toward the docks, its radar mast skewed like a snapped tree. Officials rushed to contain the narrative, but the images had already spread globally. Sahand had not fallen in battle, but had succumbed to an accident in peacetime inside its own harbor. The Iranian Navy moved quickly to release a statement. They claimed that the ship had been undergoing repairs at the time and that the incident occurred due to a technical failure during maintenance. They emphasized that the vessel was docked and uncrewed during the event, downplaying the damage and dismissing early rumors of sabotage. Still, multiple reports indicated that at least a small skeleton crew had been present, and while no deaths were officially reported, injuries were quietly acknowledged in follow-up briefings. What caused the disaster remained shrouded in ambiguity. Naval analysts speculated on several potential factors. One theory suggested a critical miscalculation during ballast operations, an error in redistributing the ship's internal water tanks, which can destabilize the entire vessel if not properly managed. Others hinted at structural fatigue or a compromised hull valve left unchecked. Given the extreme heat, maintenance in less than ideal conditions might have played a role. But behind the technical talk lay a deeper, more symbolic blow. For a ship that had traveled halfway around the world, survived storms, and proudly represented its country in foreign waters, to suddenly keel over in its own home port was nothing short of ironic. The image of Sahand on its side, lifeless, silent, stood in stark contrast to the triumphant parades of 2021. The event triggered a wave of reflection within the Iranian defense community. How could one of the Navy's most advanced warships, still relatively new, fall victim to what seemed like a mundane maintenance error? Some critics pointed to Iran's tight-lipped approach to military transparency, suggesting that the rush to build and display ships might have outpaced the ability to maintain them. Others lamented the strain of sanctions, which limited access to replacement parts and foreign expertise. Internationally, reactions ranged from surprise to quiet schadenfreude. Some regional rivals saw the incident as a metaphor for Iranian overreach, a modern warship with global aspirations, undone by gravity and neglect. But more sober observers recognize it as a reminder of the inherent risks of sustaining a modern navy with limited resources. Naval operations are complex even in ideal conditions. Under embargo and economic strain, they become exponentially more difficult. Despite the incident's severity, Iran's officials were quick to signal that this was not the end of Sahand's story. Recovery operations began within days. Naval divers and engineers worked under tight deadlines, erecting cranes and support platforms to stabilize the tilted ship. The Navy vowed not only to salvage Sahand, but to return it to service, stronger and better equipped. But the questions lingered. Would it ever sail again? Could its systems be trusted after such trauma? Was this a one-time incident or the symptom of deeper issues? What had been a sleek silhouette slicing through the Atlantic was now a bruised frame hunched in the sun. The sea, it seemed, had claimed the Sahand not in violence, but in silence. And that silence would echo as recovery efforts unfolded, a quiet pause before the next chapter began. Salvaging a warship is never a straightforward task, especially not one as symbolic and recently active as IRIS Sahand. Yet within days of its capsizing in Bandar Abbas, Iranian authorities initiated a recovery mission that would be as much about image as it was about steel. The ship's partial submersion presented serious engineering challenges, and failure to address them quickly risked irreversible damage to its electronics, propulsion systems, and structural integrity. By the second week after the incident, massive cranes had been brought into the port. Divers worked in tandem with naval engineers to assess damage beneath the waterline. Video footage showed support scaffolding being erected alongside the hull, while hoses and pumps began the slow process of draining compartments flooded during the capsize. The Iranian Navy remained tight-lipped on the ship's internal condition, but promised that restoration will be swift and complete. Onlookers in Bandar Abbas watched as teams labored in the scorching sun. For many, it was a surreal sight, watching the once proud vessel, which had sailed across oceans, now tethered like a wounded animal. Yet there was a determined energy among the workers. This wasn't just salvage, it was reclamation. Iran had invested too much in Sahand's construction and global symbolism to let it rot. Reports from local media indicated that the ship's hull had remained structurally intact, though significant internal systems would need overhaul. This included the electrical grids, radar arrays, and possibly the propulsion units, all of which had been submerged for several days. Despite that, naval officials insisted that the damage was not fatal and that Sahand would return to service within months. Behind the scenes, however, the restoration revealed more than just engineering hurdles. The effort became a proving ground for Iran's naval resilience and its domestic shipbuilding industry. Technicians from defense firms were brought in to assist with diagnostics, while military workshops worked to fabricate replacement components. In a country still largely shut out from global arms markets, this restoration was also a test of improvisation, of whether Iranian industry could reverse engineer not just ships, but entire salvage protocols. During this period, the Sahand underwent more than just repairs. Word began to spread that the Navy would use this opportunity to modernize the vessel beyond its original configuration. While unconfirmed, leaks hinted at the potential installation of vertical launch systems, VLS, for advanced missiles, updated fire control systems, and perhaps even integration with newer air defense technology such as the naval or Syad-3 platforms. Whether these upgrades were already planned or prompted by the accident remained unclear, but they signaled that the ship's role in Iran's naval strategy was far from over. Meanwhile, national media shifted its tone. No longer was the capsizing treated as an embarrassment. Instead, coverage framed the recovery as an act of determination, a comeback story in motion. Commentators drew comparisons to the Phoenix myth, calling Sahand the ship that would rise from its own failure, stronger than before. Footage of engineers hammering and welding became daily fare on state television. International observers, of course, remained skeptical. Salvaging a warship is not the same as rebuilding a car. Saltwater corrosion alone can render sophisticated systems useless within days. The long-term reliability of Sahand's missile guidance, sonar, and propulsion, once submerged, was in serious doubt. Still, the message was clear. Iran would not allow its most ambitious ship to be defined by its fall. By early 2025, the Iranian Navy announced that Sahand would rejoin active service with enhanced capabilities. Its exact operational status remains unverified, but satellite imagery confirmed that the ship had been righted, repainted, and was once again afloat at dock. Though the scars of its collapse remain hidden beneath a fresh coat of gray paint, IRIS Sahand's hull now carried not just the weight of radar and missiles, but of national memory. It had survived in dignity, doubt, and damage, and in doing so it was being reimagined, not as a fallen giant, but as a resilient relic of ambition. With Sahand once again upright and gleaming under a fresh coat of naval gray, attention began to shift from restoration to redefinition. It was no longer just about making the ship seaworthy, it was about turning it into something new, something that could justify the years of pride and investment that had been poured into it. For the Iranian Navy, this meant seizing the moment to transform the ship's functionality and reframe its legacy. Iranian officials began dropping hints. This would not simply be a reboot, but a rebirth. In military briefings, Sahand was referred to as a platform for next-generation deterrence, language that suggested significant upgrades beyond cosmetic repairs. While foreign analysts had reason to be skeptical, defense insiders confirmed that among the most anticipated additions was the integration of the Sayyad 3 missile system. Designed for medium to long-range engagement, Sayyad 3 would extend Sahand's ability to track and neutralize aerial threats well beyond its original capacity. Alongside Sayyad 3 came the Nawab short-range air defense system, believed to be an indigenous version of close-range interceptors. This multi-layered missile defense array, if effectively integrated, would allow Sahand to counter both high-altitude bombers and low-flying cruise missiles, critical in a region increasingly saturated with drone warfare and asymmetric threats. The ship's command CIWS, though already impressive, would now act as the final layer in a tiered protective envelope. Internally, Sahand was also being outfitted with improved battle management software. These upgrades aimed to better synchronize radar tracking, missile guidance, and electronic warfare, all of which had to operate seamlessly under the strain of real-time conflict. Whether these systems were fully functional remained to be proven, but on paper they represented a significant leap in Iranian naval engineering. Yet modernization wasn't just technological, it was also psychological. After a ship capsizes, it risks being seen as cursed, unreliable, or simply irrelevant. To combat that narrative, Iran launched a renewed public relations campaign. Television specials highlighted the ship's original Atlantic voyage, repeating images of Sahand cruising past Gibraltar or lining up in Russia's naval parade. Interviews with naval officers framed the capsizing not as a failure, but as a turning point, a test that the ship had endured and overcome. The vessel was also repositioned symbolically. Whereas it had previously been a tool of global outreach, Sahand was now characterized as a guardian of regional waters, ready to deter enemies and secure Iran's maritime interests in the Persian Gulf and beyond. The emphasis had shifted from international theater to regional dominance, perhaps a strategic recalibration after the lessons of the past few years. There was even talk of deploying Sahand to support anti-piracy operations in the Gulf of Aden, or to shadow foreign naval movements near the Strait of Hormuz. Though these announcements may have been more rhetorical than practical, they underscored the ship's restored utility in the Iranian playbook. And while Iran never officially acknowledged the full cost of the restoration and upgrades, it was clear that the country had invested heavily, financially, politically, and emotionally. For a nation whose navy often struggles with obsolescence and constraints, Sahand now represented a unique case, a vessel reborn through accident and adversity. As of mid-2025, Sahand had resumed limited sea trials along Iran's southern coast. Its radar masts turned slowly in the haze, its engines rumbled through short test runs, and its decks, once submerged, were again populated by uniformed crew. Observers with access to satellite imagery noted increased activity around the ship, with mobile radar stations and support vehicles parked nearby. Though its operational status remained officially vague, one thing was certain: Sahand was no longer forgotten. For Iran, the ship had become more than a piece of metal and electronics. It was a story, one of failure and persistence, of reassembly and identity. Its name, taken from a mountain, now carried new meaning. Not just strength, but the endurance to rise again after collapse. The next question was whether Sahand's story would remain one of symbolic victory or whether it would once again be tested under fire. By the summer of 2025, IRIS Sahand had fully re-entered public view, not as a relic, but as a resurrected icon. Moored once more in Bandar Abbas, it looks strikingly similar to its pre-capsize form. To the untrained eye, little had changed. But for those who had followed its story, engineers, sailors, analysts, the ship now bore an invisible second skin, layered with hard-earned lessons, retrofitted ambition, and a strangely mythic quality. Reports indicated that Sahand had completed several successful test sorties along Iran's southern maritime borders. These missions, while brief and largely symbolic, were accompanied by heavy naval escort and meticulous documentation. Each outing was filmed and broadcast, each maneuver highlighted as proof of Iran's technological competence. State media hailed the ship as a phoenix of steel, invoking both pride and poetry in the same breath. Interestingly, Sahand's renewed image wasn't just aimed outward, it was also an internal message. In military academies and naval classrooms, the ship's journey from pride to disaster to rebirth became a case study in resilience and logistics. Cadets were taught not only navigation and weapon systems, but also the human factor, the misjudgments that led to the capsize, and the coordination that made recovery possible. In this way, the ship transformed into an unlikely educational tool, its physical presence doubling as a classroom afloat. Culturally, too, Sahand gained traction. Documentaries, articles, and even art exhibitions began to draw upon the ship's arc. Some focused on its journey across the Atlantic and the symbolism of its visit to Russia. Others homed in on its collapse, those haunting photos of the hull tilting like a dying whale in port. Poets wrote of Sahand not in technical terms, but in metaphors: a soldier felled by friendly fire, a monument humbled, a ghost ship brought back to life. At tourist souvenir shops near the Naval Museum in Bandar Abbas, keychains and model replicas of Sahand began to appear, miniature versions of a ship that, not long ago, lay drowning at its own dock. This popularization reflected something deeper than commerce. It showed how the ship had embedded itself into Iran's national narrative, not as a flawless hero, but as a survivor of circumstance. Of course, questions still loomed. Would Sahand ever again participate in a long-range deployment? Could its systems withstand the strain of blue water missions? Would another capsize, or worse, undo all this restoration? The Iranian Navy refused to speculate, keeping official communications vague. But that silence carried a quiet optimism, or perhaps a quiet hope, that Sahand's second act would not end as abruptly as its first. Internationally, Sahand's story resonated for other reasons. For defense observers, it became a parable of modern naval challenges in the era of sanctions, regional rivalries, and aging fleets. For rivals, it was both a curiosity and a caution, proof that even limited naval powers can mount comebacks with enough determination. And for military planners around the world, it was a reminder that ships, like people, can defy predictions, can stumble, fall, and still rise again. By late 2025, IRIS Sahand remained docked more often than deployed, but the ship was no longer a secret, nor a shame. It had become part of a broader conversation about national identity, about endurance, about the tension between ambition and limitation. Its mast now rose with quiet dignity, its deck repopulated with sailors who understood that serving aboard this vessel meant more than operating a machine. It meant carrying forward a story. And as dusk settled over the harbor, The Sahand sat there, not roaring, not gleaming, but breathing again. A quiet monument to a nation's insistence that even in the face of collapse, dignity can be salvaged and symbols can be reborn. Even the strongest hulls face stillness. Sometimes a story doesn't end with fire or fury, but with the slow, quiet return to breath. IRIS Sahand's journey wasn't about triumph or defeat. It was about persistence, the kind that rests just beneath the surface until it's needed again. And perhaps that's the lesson the ocean keeps trying to teach us. Not everything lost stays sunken. Ships break, nations repair, but the stories, they drift. And if you listen closely, you'll always hear something waiting beneath the waves. If today's story brought you somewhere unexpected, take a moment to pause and sit with it. The sea has more to tell. And next time, we'll dive into another hidden tale, perhaps from a forgotten coast, or a sunken hold filled with whispers and rust. Thank you for sailing with me today. If you'd like to keep exploring, you know where to find me. But only come back if you're really curious about what else the water remembers.